Joining me in the studio to discuss the implications of the new ranking is Bolaji Balogun, the CEO of Chapel Hill Denham. It's great to have you on the show with us today, Bolaji. Now, this is the first time Nigeria's GDP estimate will be rebased in almost a quarter of a century. The last time this exercise was done was in 1990. So first of all, in a nutshell, what do these numbers say about Nigeria's economy?
Well, the obvious reality first and foremost is that Nigeria, we've all woken up on Sunday morning and Nigeria is officially the largest economy in Africa. I think the reality of that had been quite apparent to a number of us for a while. The fact that a number of very significant sectors which have become mainstays of Nigeria's economy were outside of those official measurements always meant that to a large extent you really weren't capturing the full extent of economic output occurring in the marketplace. That's now apparent and very obvious. I think what was quite surprising for many analysts is the actual number. Most analysts' estimates ranged between 435 billion to about 460 billion. To see a number like 510 billion, I think for most analysts was quite surprising. But even more surprising was, the extent of the contribution of the services sector. And we all expected that we'd wake up and agriculture, although, tremendous progress being made on agriculture, we expected to wake up and find that agriculture had come down. But to find that it had come down so much and that services were accounting for nearly 50%, I think is the biggest, surprise.
Surprise for you.
What does this mean? I think the first thing that it does is that it puts Nigeria on the radar of more and more people making decisions internationally. It puts Nigeria on the radar of investors, many of whom had always thought about South Africa as a natural entry point for their investments into Nigeria. It puts Nigeria on the radar of political society. When there are gatherings now of the world's largest nations, we will always potentially be at the table in those conversations. What it does do is also to place a burden of responsibility on those who govern Nigeria to actually ensure that these numbers mean something for the average Nigerian. And the reality today is that there's a big delta between what the numbers say and the reality, for the average Nigerian.
Now, this actually, apparently this is likely to lead to a slower rate of real GDP growth. Apparently, that is likely, possibly could reduce by up to 50%. What are your projections for growth now?
Certainly, I don't expect it to be that extreme. I think that GDP growth rates should slow, from around 7%, to just over 5%. But that in itself is a significant number. We were growing off, a low base before, at 509 billion. Growing at 5% is still, fairly, robust growth. I think what we need to look for is the impact that things like the power privatization program, all of the investments going into power, all of the work that's been done around agriculture in terms of trying to transform, the nation from a massive net importer, of food and agricultural products into a nation which potentially over a 5-year period could become sustainable in terms of its internal demand, but over a decade could potentially become a net importer of food and agricultural products. And as those things kick into GDP, you would expect to see the level of economic activity and economic growth
now
begin to rise again.
There's talk that this would also expose Nigeria's huge untapped tax base, especially in the non-oil sector. What's your take on that?
Absolutely. I mean, we've woken up now and we realize that potentially we're only taxing about 19 to 20% of economic activity. What we're going to need to do is again to narrow, that delta between the 19–20%, and the GDP numbers that we see now. Because what is very, very evident is that most of this economic activity is in the informal. It's not falling into the taxable net. I'm sure that if you could look at, the tax net on a per state basis, you will find that there are states in the country like Lagos that have made quite a lot of progress and are beginning to capture more and more of economic activity and people in the tax net, but on a nationwide basis, the tax base is still so slow. And if you equate taxes to the ability of government to fund development and to fund infrastructural progress, then you realize that the government has a major challenge. It's therefore not, surprising that a state like Lagos is actually the only place in the country where you're seeing very substantial infrastructural investments going in, because the state has the tax revenue base to be able to fund that development.
Now,
the nation
Ghana,
as a whole now needs to do that.
Now, when Ghana rebased in 2010, output jumped 60%.
Yes.
So I guess the question now is, how much more attractive are we now to foreign investors, and in what sectors are we likely to see the most interest?
Okay, I think first and foremost, some investors won't blink at all. Equity investors are going to take this, quite seriously. Foreign direct investors making investments in sectors that are tapping, for example, into Nigeria's consumer growth story, who had been aware of the potential of the economy, are now going to begin to look at this as a reality. For them, the number that's important is the fact that GDP per capita, has jumped, from about $1,700–1,800 per capita to $2,600, nearly $2,700 per capita. What that suggests is that consumer purchasing power is a lot stronger here than everyone had always anticipated. So for people looking to make investments, in the consumer sector, this becomes a much more compelling, story.
But could Nigeria be replacing South Africa as a hub anytime soon?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that we've got to be careful when we say this, because this mustn't become a diplomatic issue, between Nigeria and South Africa. The reality of it is that, South Africa had really always been, regarded as the entry point into Africa. I think increasingly that will change. People had always been, aware in their conversations about the demographic power of Nigeria, but now they see some economic numbers to match, that obvious demographic, strength. And more when you make an investment decision about Africa, Nigeria will be central to that.